So many roads just north of Shelton here in Mason County look just like this one. There are several roads that are overflowing, and that's coming from the Skokomish River.
A Washington road suddenly turned into a frantic silver river as salmon bypassed their usual route entirely.
This salmon in Washington state is trying to swim upstream. The Skokomish River rose out of its banks and flooded the street.
The site is pretty common for this time of year. The Skokomish River is one of the most flood-prone rivers in Washington state.
Thrashing across pavement during a massive November atmospheric river. It looked like pure chaos, but this was actually precision. A desperate, evolved behavior scientists are just beginning to understand. These fish were invading forbidden zones to spawn in areas they shouldn't reach. It's a secret weapon against disaster that completely rewrites the rules of the river. Let's dive in. Flood's fury unleashed. It was early November 2025. Specifically, the peak of chaos hit right around November 6th. Now, in Mason County, Washington, residents are used to a little rain, sure. It's the Pacific Northwest. But this was an atmospheric river on steroids. Imagine 10 inches of relentless driving rain dumping onto the Olympic Mountains in just 48 hours. Think about that for a second. That much water has to go somewhere, and it certainly wasn't staying in the river channel. The Skokomish River, a river that, frankly, is already the most flood-prone in the entire state, simply erupted over its banks. It didn't just rise, it surged. It turned from a controlled body of water into a raging, muddy brown nightmare that completely consumed the valleys below. Here's the thing about this area. This wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a disaster with a long, messy human history. For over 100 years, we've been logging the mountains and building dikes along the riverbanks to try to control them. But all those decades of dikes and dams, they actually choked the river's natural flow. Think about the engineering approach. It was all about confinement. They tried to turn a chaotic, meandering river into a predictable drainage ditch. It was a massive experiment in human arrogance against nature. For a century, these dikes were sold as the ultimate protection, but they fundamentally altered how the watershed handled pressure. Instead of spreading out across the valley, the river was forced to run faster and higher, dramatically increasing the sheer destructive force when it finally broke through. They narrowed the channel and allowed sediment to build up high on the riverbed. So, when this atmospheric river slammed into the coast, the water had nowhere to go but up and out. The dikes didn't protect the valley. They practically guaranteed that when a big enough storm hit, the flooding would be catastrophic. According to a 2025 assessment by the Hood Canal Coordinating Council, the sedimentation levels had raised the riverbed by nearly 4 feet in some sections, drastically reducing the river's capacity to hold water during intense rainfall. The river was just waiting for an excuse to take its valley back. If you look at the footage from Fox 13 Seattle from those days, it's just pure, unadulterated drama. You see muddy brown water rushing with terrifying speed, totally swallowing up agricultural fields and residential areas. There are shots of roads in Mason County looking like rivers themselves, flashing with debris. It's the kind of scene that makes you pause and realize how small we are against that kind of power. But amidst all this destruction, something truly bizarre was happening. It wasn't just water covering the roads, it was fish. Specifically, hundreds of salmon, Chinook and steelhead, were literally thrashing across the pavement over a kilometer upstream from the actual riverbank. It looked like absolute chaos, but it was actually a kind of frantic, desperate precision. Now, you'd assume these fish were just lost, right? Caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, trying frantically to find their way back to the main river channel before they died in a drying-out ditch. Honestly, that's what the local scientists and residents assumed too. It's the logical conclusion. The flood breaks the rules, so the salmon get broken too. But here's where it gets interesting and, frankly, a little weird. What if I told you they weren't trying to get back to the river at all? What if I told you the chaos was actually a long-rehearsed plan? The scientists watching this, the ones who study these salmon runs and the health of the Skokomish, weren't just shocked by the footage of fish dodging cars on a rural road. They were shocked because they started to realize these salmon weren't just fleeing the flooding. They were using it. For millennia, salmon have evolved to handle unpredictable environments. But humans have spent a century creating a very specific, broken environment here. And yet, the salmon? They figured out how to hack it. They were exploiting the very floodwaters that were destroying human infrastructure to spawn in zones that are usually entirely forbidden to them. Zones that were dry land just hours before the river broke its banks. It's a secret weapon that mainstream science has largely ignored until now. We look at this flooding and see destruction. The salmon look at this flooding and see an opportunity. It completely rewrites the rules of the river, turning a disaster into an evolutionary advantage. The Skokomish tribe's monitoring gauges were already recording historic flows on November 1st, but by November 6th, the river had passed its flood stage and was heading toward near-record levels. The valley was a scene of devastation, but for the fish, it was the start of something big. But why here? Why now? Salmon's secret map. So, you've got hundreds of salmon thrashing across a flooded road in Washington, looking like they've completely lost their minds.
Well, here's a story you just have to see to believe. We all know why the chicken crossed the road, but what about the fish? Check out this bizarre sight. That is salmon making their way across a street in Washington state.
But here's the thing. They hadn't. They were actually following a map. A map that's hard-coded into their DNA. One that we, in all our wisdom, spent a century trying to erase. You see, for a salmon, finding your way back to your specific spawning bed after years in the open ocean is like navigating from Tokyo to a specific street corner in London without GPS in pitch blackness. And they do it. It's not magic. It's a terrifyingly precise mix of biology and physics. First, they have this insane sense of smell. They can detect a single drop of water from their home stream diluted into an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It's called olfactory imprinting. When they're just tiny fry, they learn the chemical signature of the river they were born in. And when they come back to spawn, they follow that scent trail like a bloodhound. But that only works when they're close to the river mouth. How do they get across the entire Pacific Ocean? Well, scientists believe they use the Earth's magnetic field. They actually have microscopic crystals of magnetite in their brains. They're literally swimming with a compass in their heads, navigating by the magnetic lines of force to find the exact coastline they need. Now, imagine you're a salmon trying to use this ancient navigation system in the modern Skokomish River. For the last 100 years, we've built dikes to confine the river to a narrow channel, logging the hillsides so the water rushes off too fast, and basically turning the river into a straight pipe. We forced the river to act like a plumbing system rather than a living ecosystem. And in doing so, we essentially broke the salmon's map. The smell of their home stream was getting lost in the polluted, diverted water. The magnetic cues were hard to follow when the river's natural floodplains, the slow side channels where they would typically hide and rest, were entirely cut off by levees. We thought we were managing the river, but we were actually blinding the fish to their own home. And then, November 2025 hits. The dikes couldn't hold. The atmospheric river brought so much rain that the Skokomish did the only thing it could do. It breached the levees and flooded over 50 acres of what used to be its natural floodplain. This is where it gets interesting. The flood wasn't just destroying roads, it was undoing all our fixes. That vast expanse of water was bypassing the engineered barriers, reconnecting the main river to those quiet side pockets that hadn't seen salmon in decades. The flood was essentially restoring the river to its natural state, right when the fish needed it most. Think about that for a second. The exact thing we've been trying to stop, flooding, is the exact mechanism the river uses to keep itself healthy, and the salmon use to find their way home. Now, picture those salmon on the road. From a drone shot, it looks like a confused mess. But they weren't swimming blindly. They were navigating a temporary river that had suddenly appeared over the pavement. The floodwater was creating a new temporary route that led directly toward the newly opened floodplain pockets. The salmon knew, or rather, their DNA knew, that this shortcut was their only way to reach the spawning grounds that were otherwise blocked by our dikes. This behavior, verified by tribal technicians documenting the event, shows a remarkable adaptability to infrastructure that technically should have stopped them in their tracks. It wasn't chaos, it was a desperate, evolved hack. And here's where the science gets truly mind-blowing. Scientists from NOAA and the Skokomish tribe were studying this, and they started trapping juvenile Chinook and steelhead in these newly flooded areas. What they found shattered all their expectations. Usually, when a river floods, you'd expect the young fish to be washed away, struggling to survive in the turbulent water. That's what the textbook says. But that's not what happened here. These flood refuges, these pocket estuaries that the floodwater created, were teeming with life. The juvenile salmon weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They were finding massive amounts of food, insects and crustaceans that were washed into the water from the flooded land. Because they weren't fighting the main raging current of the river, they could conserve energy. The result? They were growing at twice the speed of their counterparts, who were stuck in the main river channel. Imagine a kid who suddenly gets to eat nothing but high-energy food while resting in a safe, warm room, instead of fighting through a storm. That's what these fish had. It's tempting to think we can manage nature, but the salmon are showing us that the river has a memory, and that memory includes the floods. When we build dikes, we aren't just protecting a road. We are actively reducing the foraging time for these fish by up to 40%, because we've eliminated the slow water habitats where they feed and rest. When the flood breaks through, it forces that foraging time back up. It's like the river is shouting, "Remember this." The story of the road swarm is even wilder. Those fish weren't just crossing the road and dying. Observers noticed them thrashing over the pavement, and then, almost instantly, darting into these side channels at incredible speeds. They were navigating using a combination of their ancestral memory and the immediate physical cues of the floodwaters. They were moving at speeds nearly double what they would achieve in a typical, calm stream, powered by the sheer force of the flood pushing them toward their destination. Imagine the sensory overload for these fish. They are swimming through water filled with debris, navigating over asphalt instead of gravel, yet their biological compasses are firing perfectly. They were reacting to chemical cues washed out of the floodplain that told them, "Safe harbor is right here." It is a testament to how refined their migratory instincts are, overriding immediate environmental chaos to fulfill their biological imperative to spawn. The scientists who were watching this were not just impressed, they were utterly floored. They had spent years trying to figure out how to restore the Skokomish estuary, spending millions on projects to bring back salmon numbers.
We put in bridges and culverts on Flats Road up into the forested wetlands. So it was about 10 years worth of restoration, 3 major phases, about $9 million, and about 900 acres of restored salt marsh and estuary and forested wetlands.
And here, in a matter of hours, a natural disaster did more to reconnect the river to its floodplain than all our engineering combined. This brings us to a really uncomfortable truth that nobody in the management agencies really wants to admit. Our fixes blinded the fish to their own map, and it took a massive flood to fix it. It really makes you wonder if these salmon don't know the river better than we do. We look at a map and see a road that's flooded. The salmon look at the same map and see a newly opened highway to their spawning grounds. We're starting to realize that all those dikes and engineering projects didn't make the river safer. They just made it more fragile. And the salmon, in their own desperate way, are pointing that out. This revelation, that floods are actually the key to salmon survival, is forcing scientists to completely rethink how we manage these watersheds. It's not just about stopping the water. It's about learning to live with the flood and even exploiting it. just like the salmon do. The Skokomish tribe has been saying this for years, that the river needs its floodplain. But it takes seeing the salmon actually doing it, actually using the chaos to their advantage, for the rest of the world to really sit up and take notice. It's a story about adaptation, about the incredible power of evolution to find a way, even when humans have put every possible barrier in its path. It's a story about the hidden intelligence of the natural world. And what happened next? Scientists' jaws dropped when traps showed the real numbers. Numbers that shocked labs. So, you've got these scientists watching fish cross a highway in the middle of a massive flood in November 2025. Honestly, most people probably just thought, well, those fish are doomed. But the researchers, the ones from the Skokomish tribe and NOAA who were out there with their gear in the middle of a downpour, were thinking something completely different. They were looking at that chaos and seeing data. And when they finally got their traps set and started collecting numbers, their jaws absolutely dropped. Here's the thing about salmon research. You don't get answers quickly. It's a waiting game. But the data from the Skokomish River post-flood was anything but slow. When they started counting the juvenile fish, the smolts, heading out to sea, the numbers were so high they thought their equipment was broken. Chinook smolt numbers were up a staggering 35% compared to the previous year. 35%! In a river system that's been plagued by declining runs for decades, a jump like that isn't just good news. It's practically unheard of. It completely shattered the models that the state agencies were using. Think about that for a second. We spend millions on engineered habitat restoration, trying to build the perfect quiet spot for salmon to grow, and then a massive atmospheric river dumps 10 inches of rain, rips up the dikes, and creates more productive habitat in 2 days than we could build in 2 years. It's wild. Now you'd think that with all that raging muddy water, predators would have a field day. If you're a heron or a seal, that sounds like a buffet, right? But the salmon has a trick for that too. They use the sediment. The water is so thick with mud and debris from the flooded valley that the salmon are practically invisible to predators. It's a perfect muddy camouflage. The same chaos that's destroying human infrastructure is actually providing a safe harbor for the fish. It's a total reversal of what you'd expect. To really appreciate how insane this is, you have to compare it to the dry years. In 2023, when Washington was dealing with a massive drought, the salmon numbers were abysmal. The river was just a trickle. The water was too warm, and the smolts were essentially trapped in a small, dangerous channel. They were easy pickings for predators and struggled to find enough food. But compare that to 2025, when the river flooded. The flood did the exact opposite of the drought. It connected the river to 50 acres of floodplain, giving the juveniles space to spread out, hide, and gorge on insects that were washed into the water from the flooded fields. The outmigration peak, the time when the maximum number of smolts head to the ocean, happened 20% faster than in those dry years. The fish were healthier, they were bigger, and they were hitting the ocean at the perfect time. Contrast this with the Tulalip tribe's 2022 study on the nearby Skokomish, which showed that prolonged dry periods severely restrict juvenile survival rates, highlighting that flood events are actually crucial for population acceleration. And this wasn't just happening in a vacuum. Similar trends were being modeled on other rivers, like the Skokomish, where researchers were seeing that flood-connected habitats were producing exponentially more salmon. The Skokomish was just the most dramatic example. If salmon predict floods better than we do, what does that say about climate prep? The people making this happen, the ones getting their hands dirty, were the technicians from the Skokomish tribe. They were out there tagging these fish while the water was still rising. They were using real-time monitoring, placing PIT tags, passive integrated transponders, basically tiny GPS trackers for fish, into the juveniles right in the middle of the flood. They were tracking exactly where these fish went, and the data showed them darting out of the main river and into these newly formed side channel sanctuaries. They were seeing them grow at twice the rate of fish stuck in the main channel. It's a stark contrast to what most of the fishing community was bracing for. In fact, if you look at the tentative fishing seasons set for 2025 and 2026, they were almost entirely based on the assumption of a declining run. The managers were expecting bad news, and they were planning to restrict fishing even further. They had no idea that the river was about to throw them a curveball. The uncomfortable truth here, and this is what really shocks the labs, is that the salmon are outpacing our models. Our scientists, with all their computers and formulas, were predicting doom for these runs. They were focusing on the destruction caused by the flood, not the opportunity it created. According to fisheries data, most models for salmon survival are based on standardized average rainfall years. They struggle to account for extreme events, particularly the benefits of sudden, dramatic habitat expansion. When the dikes failed, they weren't just failing to protect roads, they were failing to confine the river to a channel that had become far too small for modern climate realities. The scientists had to admit that their data sets were fundamentally missing this crucial, chaotic component of salmon life cycle management. But the salmon, they don't rely on models. They rely on millions of years of evolution. They know how to use the floods that we spend so much energy trying to stop. It's almost as if the fish are telling us, we don't need your dikes. We need the river to be wild. When you look at this data, you start to realize that maybe we've been looking at the whole thing wrong. We see a flood as a disaster. The salmon see it as a population accelerator. And the numbers, as they say, don't lie. It's a story about adaptation on a level that's hard for us to comprehend. The salmon aren't just surviving. They're leveraging the destruction of our infrastructure to fuel their own recovery. They are hacking the system. But what happens when these fish, these massive, healthy, fast-growing smolts, make it to the ocean and come back in a few years? That's where the story gets even more interesting. Tribe's hidden playbook. So, you've got these incredible numbers, a 35% jump in smolts, coming out of a flooded river in Washington. And everyone's looking at this like, wow, nature is amazing. And yeah, it totally is. But here's the thing, they are not telling you on the news that 35% didn't just happen by accident. It was actually the result of a hidden playbook that the Skokomish tribe has been running for over a decade. We tend to think of this as just a story about a big flood, but it's really a story about long-term vision. Now, if you go back to, say, 2015, the Skokomish River was a disaster zone. The logging companies had stripped the hillsides, and the state had built massive dikes to keep the river from flooding the valley. It was a total mess. The salmon were disappearing, and the river was basically dying. But the Skokomish tribe, they knew this wasn't right. They started this long, slow project to restore the estuary, which is basically where the river meets the sea. They were removing those old dikes, creating these 200 acres of rearing habitat where the juvenile fish could grow. And it was hard work. They were constantly fighting against the developers and the local government, who saw these dikes as essential protection. But the tribe knew something that the engineers didn't. You can't fight the river. You have to work with it. They were building these habitats, but they were essentially just waiting for the river to come back to life. And then, November 2025 hits. The atmospheric river comes in and brings all that rain we talked about. And instead of the river breaking through the dikes and causing destruction, it actually activated all that work the tribe had been doing. That 50 acres of floodplain we mentioned earlier? That was part of the tribe's plan. They had engineered these areas to be ready for just this kind of surge. So, when the water finally broke through, it didn't just flood a road. It filled these perfectly designed sanctuaries. It was like they were setting the stage for a performance, and the flood was the main actor. The tribe's hydrologists, the people who study how the water moves, were ecstatic. One of them actually told a local reporter, "It's like the river is remembering itself." Think about that for a second. It's not just that the flood brought water. It brought the right kind of water to the right place, activating a network of side channels and ponds that hadn't functioned in over a century. And here's where it gets even weirder. When the floodwaters rushed in, they brought a ton of debris, logs, branches, trees, that got caught in these new habitats. Normally, you'd see a log jam and think it's just a blockage. But for the salmon, these debris jams are like a secret fortress. They break up the current, creating calm pockets of water where the fish can rest. And they provide incredible hiding spots from predators. Data actually shows that these log jams can reduce predation on juvenile salmon by up to 40%. They are essentially creating a safe zone, using the destruction of the flood to build a shield for the fish. The tribe wasn't just managing the water, they were managing the habitat, using the power of the flood to do the heavy lifting. If you look at the Instagram release from the tribe back in July 2025, months before the big flood, you can see them releasing these tiny spring Chinook juveniles into the upper watershed. They were already seeding the river, betting on their long-term restoration work. They were playing the long game, and the flood was the final piece of the puzzle. It's a perfect example of what happens when human restoration teams up with natural processes. The tribe fixed the habitat, and the flood perfected it. Was this tribe wisdom or science, which edges out in your view? The shift in the conversation is pretty incredible, too. For years, the tribe was fighting against local stakeholders, the farmers, the landowners, the loggers. But now, that's changing. These local groups are starting to realize that the tribe's approach actually makes the valley safer in the long run. By letting the river flood into these controlled areas, you reduce the pressure on the dikes elsewhere. That is the crucial insight. It's not about giving up control. It's about changing the definition of control. The old model was rigid and fragile. The new model, championed by the tribe, is flexible and resilient. It recognizes that in a watershed like the Skokomish, the only way to protect homes is to sometimes allow the river to take over the farmland. It's a total shift from an adversarial relationship with the river to a partnership, one that respects the river's need for space to maneuver during these intense atmospheric river events. It's not a fight anymore, it's a collaboration. They are realizing that the old way of thinking, that we can control the river, was actually making the floods worse. The dikes were too restrictive, and they were just waiting for a storm big enough to shatter them. The tribe's approach is about letting the river breathe, and the success they're seeing in the Skokomish is now being used as a model for other watersheds across the Pacific Northwest.
Changed into homes and fields. And so that caused channelization and aggradation of the river. And so now the river is one of the most frequently flooded rivers in the entire Pacific Northwest.
It's a blueprint for how to deal with climate change. As storms become more intense, we can't keep building higher walls. We have to create more room for the water. But this isn't just about saving fish. It's about saving ourselves. The same restoration projects that help the salmon also help to reduce flood damage to homes and roads. It's a win-win, but it takes the kind of vision that the tribe has shown for decades. It really makes you stop and think about who knows the land better. The ones who have lived on it for generations, or the ones who just look at a map and think they can control it with concrete. The tribe has shown that they don't just know the river. They understand its rhythm. They know that a flood isn't just a disaster. It's a vital part of the river's life cycle. They have taken what we used to think of as an enemy and turned it into an ally. The Skokomish tribe's work is a testament to the power of traditional ecological knowledge. It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to solve a modern problem is to look to the past and to trust in the wisdom of those who have been watching the water for centuries. And the result is a river that is not just surviving, but thriving. As noted in recent ecological reports, this collaborative approach has shifted the focus from merely managing disaster to actively cultivating resilience within the watershed. A river that is, finally, remembering itself. The salmon proved that sometimes the best way to handle a disaster is to work with it, not against it. The Skokomish tribe knew this all along, but now the science backs them up. It's a fascinating look at how nature adapts when we let it. But what do you think? Should we be doing more to let our rivers flood naturally? Drop your thoughts below.